Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name is Juan and welcome back to another book review. So today we're going to talk about the celebrated novel As I Lay Dying by the American writer William Faulkner. As I Lay Dying was first published in 1930 and it is considered to be one of the best American novels from the 20th century. If you appreciate my reviews and would like to show your support, please give this review a like and subscribe to my channel. Those very simple acts won't cost you anything, but they will help my videos get to more people who will also appreciate them. So thank you for doing that. Now let's talk about As I Lay Dying. As with many novels and stories by Faulkner, the narrative here takes place in the fictional rural Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi. Addie, the matriarch of a poor rural family, the Bundrens, has died, and her family wants to take her body to Jefferson. The novel is more or less an account of what happens in that journey. But things are not as straightforward as that might suggest in this novel. As I Lay Dying is a first-person narrative told by 15 different characters spread over 59 chapters. If you have read any Faulkner before, you would be used to his complex narrative structures that he uses. I reviewed another one of his great novels, The Sound and the Fury, a while back, so you might also want to check that out. But going back to As I Lay Dying, just try to picture the scene. A poor family in the American rural South in 1930. They haul this old woman's dead body onto a wagon and then proceed to travel for miles. Nature is not always on their side, okay? They face so many different weather conditions. The road is treacherous and they are ill-prepared for it. So I think As I Lay Dying has a simple yet great premise for a novel. So many things could go wrong, so many conflicts could arise, and they do. There are many stories that involve journeys. It's probably the oldest or one of the oldest narratives that we have in Western literature. Just think of the Odyssey by Homer. The Odyssey is one of the oldest works of literature in the West, and it chronicles the journey undertaken by Odysseus on his way back home to Ithaca after the Trojan War. Journeys can be fascinating. They have been fascinating since ancient Greek times and probably before, and continue to be so to this day. You know, a couple of weeks ago, a movie featuring a journey, Nomadland, won the Oscar for Best Picture. And by the way, if you haven't seen Nomadland yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. What an amazing movie. Okay, there are a lot of novels that chronicle journeys. Don Quixote, Candide, The Road, you name it. Anyway, I think journeys work so well in fiction, among other things, because they give writers the chance to explore their characters deeply by having them face different issues that they would not have to face if they stayed put. Mostly, I think that journeys have a deeper, more metaphorical dimension in fiction. The cliche or the trope that we are most familiar with is that of a character that would go through a transformation or learn some important lessons on his or her journey. But that is not what you are going to get from As I Lay Dying. If you are thinking of getting into Faulkner, well, good luck. But seriously, I would recommend As I Lay Dying or The Sound and the Fury as good entry points, and you might just want to stay there as well. I don't know how accessible those books are. I think that would depend on what you have read and enjoyed before. But Faulkner is one of the most fascinating American writers of all time. So if you have an interest in American lit, then you'll need to read Faulkner at some point, okay? And also, you know, Faulkner is a huge influence, not only for American writers, but also for their Latin American counterparts. For instance, Gabriel Garcia Marquez owes a huge debt to Faulkner. So if you have read some of his work and enjoyed it, you might also enjoy reading Faulkner. By the way, I have reviewed Garcia Marquez's masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude, here on my channel, so I'm going to link to that review in case you're interested. And the influence, I think, is not just a matter of style here. I think it is also a matter of themes. Some of the big themes in As I Lay Dying are death and family, which Garcia Marquez also explores in his work. But I would say that Garcia Marquez is a lot more accessible than Faulkner. And one of the reasons for this is that in As I Lay Dying, we have 15 different narrators. And that means that we go into the minds of 15 different people. All of them are going through the same thing, in theory, but each of them has their own perspective on it. And something that I think is interesting is how we can see that what those characters think and what they say are not always the same thing. Sometimes it can be hard to follow the thread, that's true, so I would suggest that you take your time reading this novel. Faulkner did not invent interior monologue, but he's one of the main writers who use it that comes to mind. Others would be James Joyce or Virginia Woolf. And at the time of filming this video, making this video, I am struggling through my first read of Ulysses by Joyce. And next to that, I would say that As I Lay Dying is very straightforward, okay? So it's all relative, I guess. I don't want to give you the impression that As I Lay Dying is a difficult and boring book that would almost be unreadable, because that is not true. And you know, a lot of you might find it easier than I did. Okay, there is a lot more I would like to say about this novel, but I can only do that if I talk about the plot in more detail. So if you haven't read As I Lay Dying yet, or don't want to hear any spoilers, you should probably stop watching this video right about now, because between now and the end of this video, I am going to talk about the plot in a lot of detail. I'm going to be talking about the characters and some of the themes in more detail that I have so far, and there will be some spoilers. So if you don't want any spoilers, you have been warned. You should stop watching now, and I'll see you again very soon, I hope, for another book review. Okay, for those of you who are still here, I am going to summarize the plot of As I Lay Dying right now. Okay, so the Bundren matriarch, Addie, is still alive, but only barely at the beginning of the novel. She is dying, and her oldest son, Cash, who has a broken leg, is making her coffin. Addie is in the house, and Cash is making the coffin right outside. She can see her son making her coffin. How's that for a strong image? Now, everyone just knows that Addie will die soon. She has more children other than Cash. Her sons, Jewel and Darl, go to town to make some kind of delivery, and soon after, Addie dies. Another one of her sons, the youngest child, Vardaman, makes a mental association between his mother's death and the fish he had caught earlier on that day. The fish he caught is no longer a fish after he cleans it, and his mother is no longer herself after she dies. I think there's something deep about human identity on that thought. Something I also have thought about before. You know, how fragile not only life is, but also our identity. Anyway, let's go back to the plot. So Cash manages to finish building the coffin. Vardaman cannot sleep that night because he keeps thinking of his mother being in a box, so he makes some holes on the lid overnight. Dewey Dell is Addie's daughter. She doesn't seem to mourn her mother. You see, the problem is that Dewey is single and pregnant, so she has that to worry about. Now, the following day, there is a funeral service in the house. Darl and Jewel return from town a few days later, and as they approach the house, they notice buzzards flying over, and they conclude that their mother must be dead. The patriarch of the family is Ans, who promised his late wife that she would be buried in Jefferson, and Ans is determined to fulfill his late wife's dying wish. But there is another reason Ans wants to go to Jefferson. He wants to buy false teeth for himself. Now, The easiest thing would have been for Addie to be buried at home, but that seems to be out of the question here. So everyone tries to lift the coffin into a wagon, but Jewel is the one who finally gets a job done. However, Jewel doesn't want to go on the wagon with the rest of the family, so instead he follows them on his horse. And here is when we learn that Jewel bought that horse when he was younger, thanks to working secretly for a neighbor at night. So anyway, the journey to Jefferson begins. The family spends the first night with a local family. Then they must face their first problem in their journey. Due to a recent flood, the main bridges that lead out of town to turn around when they get to the river and are only able to try to cross it when they find a ford. However, a stray log upsets their wagon, causing the coffin to be knocked out. Cash is then injured. He injures his broken leg again, and the mules drown. With the help of their neighbor, Vernon Tull, Jewel manages to rescue the wagon and the coffin. Everyone then looks for Cash's tools on the riverbed. Vernon's wife Cora then remembers how Addie respected her son Jewel more than God, which is a bit weird. And we find out the reason next when we go into Addie's mind, and here it is not clear if we hear from her as a dead person or if this is some kind of flashback, but we do get Addie's recollection of some of the main events in her life. It is thanks to this that we find out that her marriage with Anne was loveless and that she had an affair with a minister named Whitfield. Addie also recalls the birth of her children. We find out that Jewel's biological father is Minister Whitfield and not Anne's, and that, I think, explains Addie's devotion to that child. Then we hear from Whitfield himself, and we find out that once he almost told Anne the truth about his affair with Addie, but then decided against it. Aved then sees Cash about his broken leg. Cash is very stoic and doesn't complain about the pain, but he faints. Then Anne buys new mules to push the wagon, even if that means mortgaging his farm equipment, using all the money he had saved for his false teeth, using Cash's savings, and trading in Jewel's precious horse. Finally, the Bondurants can continue their journey to Jefferson. So they get to a town called Mautzin, and at that point their wagon stinks because it's been many days since Addie's death. I just don't want to imagine how bad that smell would be. Anyway, Dewey is still worried about her pregnancy and has decided to have an abortion. So while in town, she tries to buy an abortion drug. However, the pharmacist doesn't sell it to her and instead tells her to get married. Also, while in town, the family buys some cement and Darl makes a cast for Cash's broken leg with it. However, the cast is so makeshift and crappy, really, that it only makes things worse for poor Cash, who is even in more pain wearing it than he was before. That night, the family spends the night at a farm. They leave the wagon in the barn, but Darl is so fed up with this journey that he burns down the barn just to incinerate his mother's remains and be done with all of that. However, Jewel, who else, salvages the coffin and also rescues the animals. Darl's reaction is to lie on top of the coffin and cry. Finally, the following day, the family arrives in Jefferson and Addie is buried. Darl is committed to a mental institution in Jackson for the bonfire. Dewey tries to buy an abortion drug again, but she's conned by the boy who works at the pharmacy. The boy demands to have sex with her in exchange for the drug, and that happens. And soon after, Dewey realizes that the drug he has given her is not for abortions, so she remains pregnant anyway. The following day, Anne shows up wearing new false teeth and with a new bride in tow. It turns out that he met a local woman while he went to borrow shovels to bury his late wife. Anne introduces his new bride to his children, and the novel ends there. Now, the plot is quite simple, but there is a lot more to it than it may appear, I think. Of course, you know, the way Faulkner chooses to tell the story by having 15 different first-person narrators, including possibly a dead woman, is what makes this novel great. But what do you make of Dewey trying to abort while she's meant to be mourning her dead mother? I think that, consciously or not, Dewey doesn't want to have the kind of life her mother, Addie, had. We know that Addie married Anse but never loved him, so by trying to have an abortion, Dewey is trying to avoid having to marry that farm hand that she had sex with. Okay, now childbearing and childbirth are supposed to be positive events in the life of a woman, but that is not necessarily always the case, as we know. Now, to me, how the novel deals with childbirth as a kind of death for women is the most original thing about As I Lay Dying. I expected this novel to be about social class because the main characters belong to the rural poor, and, you know, to some extent, As I Lay Dying deals with the plight of that specific social class in a time of economic hardship. But its approach is very different from that of The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I think Steinbeck, to an extent, idealizes the working poor, but I don't think Faulkner was interested in doing that at all. Anyway, I'm going to link to my recent review of The Grapes of Wrath here, so you can compare the two books for yourself. But now, really, what I would like is to hear what you have to say, what you think about As I Lay Dying. So please let me know in the comment section down below. I'm signing off now, so thank you for watching. I hope to see you again very soon for another video. Bye for now.